Welcome to Linguistics Tube. On this channel, you'll find videos about learning English, as well as more scientific videos about linguistics and psychology, and more general academic topics such as study skills, conducting research, and writing academic articles. This episode is part of my series which explores how to write effectively in English. We will learn about a range of skills which you can use generally, and I'll also share my advice for specific writing exams such as TEM-4 and IELTS. Specifically, this episode is part of my mini-series about the TEM-4 exam. Here, I will discuss the entire 2018 writing task. Throughout, I will show you some examples from both the summary section and the opinion section written by my students. Here is the article from the 2018 exam. As you can see, I have used two colours to highlight the most important information. Because this is a typical newspaper article, it often uses repetition to emphasise the key points. Therefore, the red text is the first time that a piece of information appears, and the blue text is repeated information. In your summary, you will need to decide whether to combine them by taking words and phrases from both the red and blue sentences, or paraphrase them. Most importantly, you must not write both the red and blue sentences in your summary. I'll now read the summarized parts. Conservation has led to the eviction of millions of tribal people from protected areas, which are their ancestral homelands. In the name of conservation, tribal peoples are being illegally driven out from these lands. Meanwhile, tourists and fee-paying big game hunters are welcomed in. Millions are being spent by conservationists every year, and yet the environment's in deepening crisis. Conservation must stick to international law, protect tribal people's rights to their lands, listen to them, and then be prepared to back them up as much as they can. Tribal people's rights have to be acknowledged and respected. They have to be treated as the best experts at defending their own lands. Like I said, this is the key information that you must include in your summary. During the exam, when you read the article for the first time, you should highlight or underline the most important words and phrases like I have done here. This will definitely help you to write the summary because it will help you to focus on the most important information. The reason that I recommend you to spend 5 minutes reading the article is so you can engage in active reading by underlining, highlighting, and circling words and writing notes next to the paragraphs. At the end of the 5 minutes, you should know the article inside out. Based on the key information that I highlighted on the previous page, I believe that 5 pieces of information need to appear in your summary. Let's have a look. Firstly, conservation has led to the eviction of tribal people from protected areas. This could also be summarized as, in the name of conservation, tribal people are being illegally driven out from their ancestral homelands. These essentially have the same meaning. Remember, even though I have included both of them here, you only need to choose one of them for your summary, or you can combine them together by taking the best parts of each. Secondly, meanwhile, tourists and hunters are welcomed in. Thirdly, millions are spent by conservationists every year, but the environment is getting worse. Fourthly, conservation must stick to international law and protect tribal people's rights. This could also be summarized as, tribal people's rights have to be respected. And finally, conservationists must listen to tribal people and back them up. This could also be summarized as, tribal people should be treated as the best experts at protecting their lands. Regarding the order of the points that you should use in your summary, you will need to decide the most logical order based on your understanding of the points. For the 2016 article about term time holidays, the chronological order of the points, or in other words, the order that they appeared in the article, was not the most logical order, and so I suggested a different order for the summary. However, for the 2017 article, I said it was fine to follow the chronological order of the points, because it feels more like an essay than a newspaper article, so it naturally uses a more logical order. In the 2018 article, the chronological order is mostly fine. However, because the fourth paragraph is an introduction to and summary of the fifth paragraph, which has more detail than the fourth paragraph, I believe that point 3 from the fifth paragraph should appear before the two main points in paragraph 4, which are repeated in more detail in paragraph 5. Regarding point 3, you may be wondering why it is important information. In fact, many of my students did not include this in their summaries. This is understandable because even though point 3 is essential, it is only briefly mentioned in the article itself, sandwiched between both versions of points 4 and 5. To understand why it is essential, we need to think about the purpose of each point on the screen. Overall, this article contains 2 problems and 2 solutions for those problems. Specifically, the first solution tackles the first problem, and the second solution tackles the second problem. The first problem is captured in point 1, which is that tribal people have been evicted from their homelands. The reason for this is that the government of the country wants to use the land to make profit, but they cannot do that if the tribal people live there. So, the government's official reason for evicting them is that the land should not be used for mining and farming. However, the government's real reason is captured in point 2, which states that money is now being made from the land through tourism and hunting. This is why the government's official reason is not an important point, because it is not the real reason why the tribal people are being evicted. Remember that there are 2 problems and 2 solutions. Points 1 and 2 deal with the first problem. Point 3 deals with the second problem, which is that conservationists are now managing the land instead of the tribal people. However, because the conservationists might have lots of knowledge about protecting the land, but they don't have hundreds of years of experience of doing so, they apparently cannot manage the land as effectively as the tribal people. So, despite spending a large amount of money, their lack of experience is damaging the environment. Perhaps pollution is increasing, and biodiversity is decreasing. This leads to the 2 solutions proposed by Stephen Corrie. To solve the problem of the eviction of tribal people, their rights to the land must be respected. And to solve the second problem of mismanagement of the environment by conservationists, tribal people should be treated as the best experts at protecting their homelands. This is why point 3 is so important. Without it, point 5 makes much less sense. Now, I'll share with you some general advice about both sections of the essay. Afterwards, we'll look at some of my students' summary sections, and finally, sections of their opinion section writing. This is another difficult topic which, like the 2017 topic, requires a lot of background knowledge to fully understand. Thus, I was pleased to see that most of my students correctly understood some of the more difficult words, like game, which in this case has an uncommon meaning, poaching, junior partners, and bushmen. For most of my students, I was happy to see that their chosen arguments were excellent, which obviously means that they correctly understood the essay instructions. We'll talk more about this soon. Regarding my students' use of evidence, remember that the essay instructions always encourage you to quote from the article. Many of my students did this, and those of them who did utilized the article effectively to support their arguments. A very suitable part to quote is the Bushman's words about knowing how to take care of the wildlife. Overall, quoting from the article allows you to avoid conjecture or the use of common sense, without using too much time to create other types of evidence yourself. So, if you cannot think of a valid piece of evidence for your argument, then use the article for inspiration. I highly recommend creating a title for your essay. This will give the reader a great first impression, especially if your title is relevant and interesting. You don't need to spend a long time thinking of an amazing title, because even a simple title is better than no title. So I highly recommend that you include one. Here are some examples of the best titles from my students. Tribal people's rights must be respected. Stop evicting tribes under the guise of conservation. A better form of conservation. The current model of conservation. Change. Conservation areas need tribal people. Protect tribal people's rights. Driving out tribal people? No. Bushmen's lives matter. Conserve tribal people. Respect their rights, acknowledge their efforts. Make conservation better. Tribal people should take the lead in conservation. Leave the job to the real experts. Here is the structure that I recommend for this essay. Paragraph 1 is the summary. Paragraph 2 is your introduction. Importantly, in the thesis statement, you must state Corey's 2 points, and then state whether you agree or disagree with the first point, and secondly, whether you agree or disagree with his second point. Therefore, paragraph 3 will explain why you agree or disagree with the first point. Paragraph 4 will explain why you agree or disagree with the second point, and paragraph 5 will be the conclusion of the essay. Before we discuss the weaknesses in detail, I must firstly say that my students' essays were overall excellent, and there are many more strengths than weaknesses. Nevertheless, I will focus on the weaknesses in this section, because doing so allows us to improve more so than complementing our strengths. Firstly, do not underestimate the importance of slowly and carefully reading the essay instructions before you plan and write your essay. If you don't, then you might misunderstand the task and write an essay on a slightly different topic. And doing this will guarantee a low grade. For the 2018 essay, the instructions asked you to comment on the 2 points made by Stephen Corey. There is therefore only one structure to properly do this, which I explained on the previous screen. To reiterate, you need to do 2 things in the thesis statement. Firstly, state the 2 points, and secondly, say whether you agree or disagree with them. Then, in the body section, your first body paragraph explains your opinion about Corey's first point, and the second body paragraph explains your opinion about his second point. In other words, the body section explains why you agree or disagree with Corey's 2 points. Corey's 2 points appear in the final paragraph of the article. Therefore, you needed to correctly identify them in order to successfully answer the question. They are: firstly, tribal people's rights have to be acknowledged and respected. Secondly, they have to be treated as the best experts at defending their own lands. The fact that these are the 2 points should be obvious by the use of firstly and secondly. However, some of my students did not correctly identify Corrie's 2 points, and instead focused on another part of the final paragraph, in which Corrie states that millions are being spent by conservationists every year, and yet the environment's in deepening crisis. This is of course point 3, which is the second problem that the article mentions. While point 3 can indeed be debated, for example, whether or not the money that is being spent is being wasted, it is not one of Corrie's 2 solutions to the problems. Therefore, you need to read the final paragraph very carefully to correctly identify which information the essay wants you to focus on. Moving on to the summaries, I must repeat something that I've said a few times before. It's unnecessary to begin your summary with an introductory opening sentence which provides background information. Instead, after the title, the beginning of your essay must contain the first important point of the summary. Every time one of my students did this, their introductory first sentence could be deleted and the second sentence could easily become the first sentence, as their second sentence summarized the first important point. We'll see an example of this later. Next, some of my students summarized every paragraph except the final 2. The 4th paragraph is a summary of the main findings of the report, and the final paragraph elaborates on this with Corrie's conclusions about the situation. However, your summary should definitely cover the final paragraph of the article, as this is the basis for the opinion section. You therefore need to summarize the 2 points that you'll discuss in the essay before you begin the opinion section. In other words, your summary is incomplete if you must introduce the 2 points after the summary section. Thirdly, as I've said before, it is a poor summary writing technique to quote the original text in your summary. Instead, everything must be paraphrased, which means that you must slightly change the words but maintain the meaning. Do not keep the original words exactly and then put quote marks around them. Next is a very different problem. While paraphrasing is important, you must still maintain the original meaning of the text. If the words become radically different, the meaning can change, and related to this is the danger of inserting your own opinion about the article into the summary. This is, again, a poor summary writing technique. The opinion section is of course where you state and explain your viewpoint about the article, so avoid inserting your opinion into the summary. We'll see an example of this in the next section. Finally, I suggest that you avoid colourful language in the summary. Remember that your summary writing is being judged on your ability to be simple, short, and succinct. You can demonstrate your excellent language skills in the opinion section of the essay. Now, let's move on to the opinion section of the essay. I'll firstly discuss the problems regarding the content. As I've said before, in an English-style argumentative essay, you must avoid being tentative when choosing a side of the argument. For example, in the thesis statement, some of my students wrote, "I quite agree with Corrie's first point." Even if it is true that you only quite agree, it is better in an essay to either strongly agree or strongly disagree. The second problem with the content of my students' opinion sections was the weakness of some of their arguments. For example, a common argument was, it is necessary to protect the tribal people's native lands. This isn't a strong argument because both sides agree that protection is necessary. Instead, you should explain either why you think the conservationists' form of protection is better than the tribal people's, or why the tribal people's form of protection is better than the conservationists. Regarding the use of evidence in your body sections to support your arguments, I saw 4 main problems in my students' essays. Firstly, for those who did use 2 pieces of external original evidence in the body paragraphs, some of them used the same type of external evidence in the 2 arguments. Even more extremely, 1 or 2 of them also used the same type in the hook, such as a quote or a statistic. Therefore, a couple of my students had 1 quote or 1 statistic in the hook in the first argument and in the second argument. Even though I am very happy to see my students using high-quality external evidence, variety is nevertheless important. So, please use 3 different types of support in the hook and evidence. Secondly, remember that I do encourage you to invent evidence, such as a quote from an expert or a study by a university. However, if you do this, then to make it convincing, it must be specific. For example, some of my students invented a quote by a tribal person, but simply introduced the quote as, "according to a tribal person." Instead, if you quote a tribal person, invent the person's name and the country he or she is from. Or, if you invent a study, then say which year it was published and which university conducted the research. Don't just say, "according to research." Thirdly, some of my students used no external objective evidence to support their 2 arguments, and instead relied on their own reasoning and their own explanation of what they assumed to be true. This was often accompanied by phrases like, "I believe," after which they offered their opinion about what they believe is the case. As I've discussed several times, especially in the episode about writing an argumentative essay, this is called conjecture, and it is not acceptable as support for an argument in the TEM-4 essay. Every claim you make must be supported by something outside of your own beliefs. Therefore, it is very possible to turn your reasoning into a piece of external evidence by making up a quote or a statistic. Fourthly, do you remember in a previous episode that I discussed the use of overstatement? Sadly, some of my students were again guilty of this, using phrases like, "it's obvious that." I'm afraid that no, your argument is not obvious only because you tell the reader it's obvious. Instead, you must convince the reader with good quality evidence. Usually, overstatement was paired with conjecture. Therefore, some of my students made unsupported claims and stated that their claim was obviously true. This is conjecture and overstatement. I hope you can see why this will not convince the reader of the validity of your arguments. You must avoid overstatement and conjecture if you want a high grade. Moving on to my students' use of language, I understand that, in the exam, you only have 45 minutes without a dictionary, so you cannot check the spelling of difficult words. However, there is no excuse for simple spelling mistakes, such as people, live instead of leave, tribal, there instead of there. Tribal is especially disappointing because the correct spelling of this word is shown many times in the article. Secondly, there were some simple grammar issues in my students' essays, such as tribal people is reliable. People is plural, so it must be are, not is. The only advice I can give you is please be careful. Thirdly, in a few of my students' thesis statements, some of them intended to use the structure "I cannot agree with him more" to show their support for Corey's 2 points. However, perhaps because of exam pressure, some of them actually omitted the word more and wrote, "I cannot agree with him." While this is grammatically correct, its meaning is the total opposite of their intention. Therefore, they would write this when they disagree with him, but their body sections did agree with him. So, you must be very careful in the crucial sections of the essay, such as when stating your viewpoint. Inconsistencies here will lower your grade. Fourthly, some of my students misunderstood the meaning of the difficult words in the article. For example, a few interpreted game as an activity that can be played, instead of the actual meaning in this context, which is animals that can be hunted. Unfortunately, the 2018 article is a very difficult text with difficult words, but this is nevertheless a weakness that lowered their grades. Finally, some of my students referred to the man in the article with his given name, not his family name or his full name. Therefore, some of them wrote, "according to Stephen," but this is incorrect. Instead, use "according to Corrie" or "according to Stephen Corrie." Perhaps, in the heat of the exam, they forgot that the order of the family name and given name is the opposite in foreign names. So, be careful, because without a doubt, the pressure of an exam can force us to make mistakes that we would never make in a normal situation. The final aspect of the opinion section that I'll discuss is its structure. I saw two common problems. Firstly, some of my students labelled the two sections of the essay with subtitles. Therefore, they began the summary with "summary section" and began the opinion with "opinion section." You don't need to do this. Instead, the two sections only need to be two separate paragraphs. Secondly, I want to remind you of something I said earlier regarding the essay instructions. Because you are required to comment on Corrie's 2 points, your thesis statement must either agree with the 2 points, disagree with the 2 points, or agree with one and disagree with the other. Then, your 2 arguments will explain why you agree or disagree with each point. Some of my students did not state whether they agreed or disagreed with the 2 points, and instead generally talked about the topic of conservation and the rights of tribal people. These essays lacked focus because they were not specifically explaining whether they agreed or disagreed with Corrie's 2 points, which is the purpose of the opinion section. In this section, we will look at several summary sections which were written by my students. Whenever you see a grade, you can use this table to understand it. Basically, a type of 70 means that the summary is acceptable, but has some significant problems which lower the grade. A type of 80 is good, or even very good, but there are a few minor weaknesses. Finally, a grade of 90 means that it is excellent overall. Firstly, I have written an answer for this topic. In this section, I will show you my summary. This is not necessarily the best possible answer. Instead, it is simply the best that I can write, and it includes all of the important points in what I believe is the most logical order. I'll read it now. Survival's report reveals that, in the name of conservation, tribal people have been illegally evicted from protected areas, their homelands. Meanwhile, tourists and hunters are welcomed in. Despite millions being spent by conservationists, those environments are getting worse. Survival's director, Stephen Corrie, concludes that tribal people's rights must be respected, and they, not conservationists, should be treated as experts in protecting their land. In my opinion, it is simple, systematic, and succinct, because it delivers all of the key information. It is 63 words, which is comfortably within the 60 to 65 words that I recommended. Let's now look at my students' summaries. Firstly, I will read each one. Then, please pause the video and answer these questions. Firstly, which important points are included in the summary? Remember, there are 5 important points. Secondly, what is good about the summary? Thirdly, what could be better about the summary? And finally, what grade would you give it? Due to the deepening crisis of the environment, more and more conservations are founded. However, most of them evicted their tribal people. Many people hold the view that these tribal people should be allowed to live in conservations instead of being evicted. On the one hand, it is their right to live on the land they have been living since their ancestor. Illegal evictions damage their rights and go against with international law. On the other hand, tribal people know more about the land and they know how to protect it. A grade of 75 means that it is acceptable overall, but has some significant weaknesses. This summary, I feel, tried a little too hard to invent an original structure. As a result, there is a lack of succinctness in several places, and there is some unnecessary information, such as the phrase, "many people hold the view that," and using "on the one hand" and "on the other hand." Regarding the important points, the writer does refer to the environment in the first sentence, but misinterprets the reason for the environmental crisis. The crisis is caused by the conservationists after the eviction of tribal people. It is not the reason for evicting tribal people. Also, point 2 is missing. Finally, the writer inserts his or her opinion into the summary, because the article never claimed that most people hold the view that these tribal people should be allowed to live in conservations. To improve the summary, the writer should follow the original points more closely and not insert ideas and phrases which are not in the original. This will help to keep the summary simple and systematic. The current model of conservation needs change and improvement for the reason that tribal people's rights should be acknowledged and respected, and they are the best experts at protecting the ancestral homelands, instead of let tourists and fee-paying big game hunters in. This summary feels more simple than the previous example. However, as a result, it omits points 1 and 3. Thus, it is shorter than 60 words. Also, the order is strange, as it presents the solution to the problems before it presents the problems. Also, there are a few language problems, such as misspelling protecting. And there are succinctness issues, such as including fee-paying big game, which isn't necessary in the summary. As a result, it gets 78. According to the report, almost all the conservations are built on the homeland of tribal peoples, causing the result of eviction of millions of tribal peoples from hometown and accusation of poaching by local people. As the conclusion of the report and director's viewpoint, the current model of conservation should be totally changed. This summary follows the order of the important points more so than the previous examples, and is a more appropriate length. However, there are some succinctness problems, such as the first sentence, which could be expressed much more clearly. See my summary for an example. Also, the phrase, "as the conclusion of the report and the director's viewpoint,"
could be much shorter. Finally, points 2, 3, 4, and 5 are missing, and so the writer instead chose to include less important points. Nevertheless, the style of the summary is much more appropriate than the previous two examples, and so it gets a grade of 82. Conservation led to an illegal deportation of tribal people and the random hunting of outsiders, and large quantities of wild animals are killed and the environment's in crisis. Facing this situation, Stephen Corey concludes that the conservation needs a complete alteration and must obey the international law, but also behind tribal people. So he puts forward 2 effective measures to reverse this deteriorating trend. Here is a summary with the grade of 85. 85 is the average grade in my classes, so this is therefore a satisfactory summary. It contains more points and uses a better order than the previous summaries. However, points 4 and 5 are missing, or at least are barely mentioned. Instead, there is some unnecessary information. Specifically, you do not need to write that 2 measures were proposed. You can simply state the 2 reasons without introducing them. A report launched by Survival International suggests that many Aboriginal people are illegally evicted due to conservation, yet it makes profit by introducing tourism and games. Survival's report concludes the system of conservation should be shaken up, and Survival's director, Stephen Corey, also illustrated that tribal people's rights should be esteemed, and that they're the very collections who know exactly how to protect their lands. I would like to show you one more summary with the grade of 85 for a specific reason. This writer misinterpreted the meaning of game in the original article and assumed it meant fun activities. As we know, this rare meaning of game is actually animals that can be hunted. This demonstrates that the articles chosen for the exam are deliberately difficult, with words and phrases that will be unfamiliar to you. A report has shown us millions of tribal people have been illegally driven out for animal conservation. Tribal people are accused of poaching, while there are still quite a few tourist and fee-paying big game hunters coming in after conservation. Survival's director, Stephen Corey, said that we should respect the tribal people's right and realize the function of them on animal conservation. A grade of 88 means that this summary is above average and is very good overall, but has 1 or 2 weaknesses. Firstly, point 3 is missing, and there is a lack of succinctness in some places, such as the phrase quite a few and fee-paying big game. Finally, there are some language issues. I'd say that it's inaccurate to only refer to animal conservation, when the issue really is environmental conservation. Survival International's report reveals conservation has led to the eviction of millions of tribal people and they're accused of poaching, while tourists and fee-paying big game hunters are welcomed in. The report concludes that the current model of conservation needs a radical shake-up. Survival's director, Stephen Corey, claimed that tribal people's rights be acknowledged and respected, and they be treated as the best experts at conservation. Here is a summary with a grade of 92, which means that it is excellent, but 1 or 2 small problems prevent it from getting a top grade. The phrase fee-paying big game could be omitted in order to make it more succinct. Also, point 3 is missing. Nevertheless, the language and style are excellent. It is reported that tribal people are facing eviction from their homeland for the purpose of environmental conservation. Meanwhile, some outsiders are welcomed in. As a result, the environment is in a more severe situation. Stephen Corey suggested that local people's rights should be respected and we should maintain their main role in defending their own land. This summary received a grade of 95, which means that it is excellent overall. It is very succinct, it contains the important points, and the language is very natural. In the final section of this episode, we will see sections from my students' 2018 opinion sections. As always, I will show you some strong and some weak sections. So some of these show good aspects of my students' writing, and others show aspects which could be better. Thus, for each of them, I will firstly read it, then please pause the video and decide what part of the structure it is, think about what you like about it, and think how it could be better. Afterwards, I will share my thoughts with you. Remember that the instructions tell you to comment on the 2 points made by Stephen Corey. Therefore, your essay must state the 2 points and explain whether and why you agree or disagree with them. I explained this structure in detail earlier in this episode. Any other structure is unlikely to properly fulfill the requirements of the essay. For example, some weaker essays generally discussed the strengths and weaknesses of conservation in general, and thus did not directly comment on Corey's 2 points. As a Chinese old saying goes, one should find the source to purify the river. It means one cannot deal with the problem well before he finds the main reason. This also applies to the relationship between tribal people and conservation. There's no doubt that tribal people could benefit conservation a lot, for which they should not be forced to leave their land. This is a strong introduction, as it opens with a relevant and interesting quote. The quote is cleverly linked to the thesis statement by 2 sentences that contain logical reasoning. However, the thesis statement would be stronger if it more clearly and directly mentioned Corey's 2 points, and stated whether the writer agreed or disagreed with them. A famous quote was stated in the Declaration of Independence: "All men are created equal." Therefore, I personally agree with Stephen Corey's opinions that tribal people's rights should be respected and they should be treated as the best experts at protecting their own land. The hook in this introduction is another strong quote. The thesis statement is much better than the previous example, as it clearly and directly states the writer's viewpoint about Corey's 2 points. Bushman Dao Chu Shu Corey said, "Wherever there are bushmen, there is game." Why? Because we know how to take care of animals. I couldn't agree more. Conservation should listen to tribal people and try its best to back them up. This hook uses a relevant quote from the article. This quote wasn't suitable for the summary, but it is very suitable for either the hook or as a piece of evidence in an argument. The writer cleverly links the quote to his or her thesis statement. "I sit and look around the country. Wherever there are bushmen, there is game. Why? Because we know how to take care of animals," said Bushman Dao Chu Shu Corey. I cannot agree with him more. In regard to conservation, we should value tribal people's rights and also regard them as masters to safeguard their beloved lands. Here is another hook, which is very similar to the previous example. Bushman Daochu Shukuri once said, "I sit and look around the country. Wherever there are bushmen, there is game." This implies that tribal people live harmoniously with nature and explains why I fully agree with Stephen Corey's 2 points. We should respect and acknowledge tribal people's rights and regard them as experts at defending their lands. This hook is very similar to the previous examples, but the introduction as a whole is even better, as it specifically states that the writer agrees with Corey's 2 points, and then it explicitly states the 2 points. This helps to maintain the narrow focus of the essay, which is not a general discussion about conservation, but a specific discussion about Corey's 2 points. Regarding conservation works conducted widely around the world, what the role of tribal people is in modern times arouses people's attention. As a quote from a film over colonial historic events goes, "The land belongs to the people it gives birth to," which accords with the viewpoints of Stephen Corey and mine as well. The thesis statement is creative and original because it presents a quote which contains the same viewpoint as both Corey and the writer. Thus, the writer uses the quote to state his or her viewpoint. Stephen Corey said, "Firstly, tribal people's rights have to be acknowledged and respected. Secondly, they have to be treated as the best experts at defending their own lands. I strongly approve of these 2 points, for they will be conducive to better conservation." This introduction cleverly states Corey's 2 points as a quote for the hook, and then comments on them in the thesis statement. Once upon a time, the wolves were driven out from the grass for sheep there to reproduce effectively without any intervention. Years later, however, the number of sheep is considerable, and most of the surface of the land were bare due to the grass being eaten out. Finally, people had to introduce wolves to curb the number of sheep. Similarly, the wolves is to sheep what tribal people is to conservational areas. Tribal people should be treated and respected as the best experts at defending their own lands. This hook is very original, as the writer uses an analogy that compares wolves and sheep to conservationists and tribal people. It is relevant and appropriate. I used to watch such a news that a tribal people were expelled from their homeland in the name of conservation. However, when these people moved to other place, their tribal culture disappeared from the world. In the other hand, the original tribe lose its characteristic. Based on this news, I would totally support Stephen Corey's opinions. Despite some significant language problems, this anecdote is relevant and emotive because it explains the consequences of evicting tribal people, which the original article didn't mention. The thesis statement doesn't repeat Corey's 2 points, but this is acceptable as long as you include them in the summary. According to the statistics by Survival International, 90% of the tribes which were protected by means of evicting the tribal peoples are in deepening crisis. So I do agree with Survival Director Stephen Corey's opinion that tribal people's rights should be acknowledged and respected, and they should be treated as the best experts at defending their own lands. This hook invents a statistic by the organization which published the report referred to in the article. This is a great way to show that your statistic is high quality and trustworthy. Stephen Corey said, "The tribal people are the junior partners. those presents my opinion that we should respect tribal people's rights and help defending their homelands. This introduction is weak because the writer unfortunately misinterpreted an essential point in the article. Corrie actually said that the conservationists are the junior partners, not the tribal people. This kind of misinterpretation easily happens in an exam when there is lots of pressure. So, do your best to read the article very carefully so that you understand the most important information as much as possible. As far as I am concerned, I partly agree with Stephen Corrie. Of course, we should acknowledge tribal people's rights of their living lands, but we can't be absolutely certain the tribal people are the best experts to defend the tribal lands. This thesis statement is interesting because the writer chose to agree with Corrie's first point, but disagree with his second point. Remember that, because Corrie stated 2 points, you need to decide whether you agree or disagree with them. Perhaps it is easiest in this exam to agree or disagree with both of his points, due to the limited time, but you are welcome to agree with one point and disagree with the other. Doing this demonstrates that you have thought carefully about the article and have a strong understanding of it. However, as what Stephen Corrie has said, we should think carefully about our actions to protect the environment. Funds and efforts are indeed wasted in conservation. Tribal people's right and wisdom should be respected. When identifying Corrie's 2 points, the writer unfortunately made a mistake. Instead of discussing the waste of money on conservation, which is point 3, the 2 main points to discuss in the essay are acknowledging and respecting tribal people's rights and treating them as the experts in conservation. Thus, the essay won't answer the question, and its grade will be lower as a result. On the one hand, tribal peoples know many rare treasures, either in shape or shapeless. There are not only heritages we can see on the land, but also ones we need to observe. After the establishment of the PRC, some villages gave some gifts to Chairman Mao, and they spoke a language no one could understand. It was not until then that we had found out that there were a small group of people who spoke and wrote in a distinctive language on the west of Hunan province. So, language, art, and literature, and so on, are all precious treasures tribal peoples possess. If we dismiss them, huge amount of loss will be caused. The evidence in this argument is based on a real-world historical situation in China. I highly recommend that you use examples based on your own culture, because it demonstrates that you have fully understood the article and you have the ability to relate situations in other countries to your own country. This skill will impress the examiner. First, tribal people are more familiar with their lands, which makes them qualified experts. As an old Chinese saying goes, it is not enough learning just from books, and practice is the only way of approaching the truth. In this case, conservationists are those with loads of theoretical knowledge, while the tribal people know more about their lands because these are their ancestral homeland. As they acquire more knowledge about the lands, they are more qualified and more suitable to protect their living places. So, they have to be treated honorously as best experts of protecting their lands. As the evidence in this argument, the writer quotes a traditional Chinese idiom. As I previously said, doing this will impress the examiner. Also, the structure of this paragraph is excellent. It has a clear and specific topic sentence. It secondly presents evidence. It thirdly explains how the evidence supports the argument through logical reasoning. And finally, it presents a wrap-up sentence to summarize and conclude the argument. To begin with, everyone should be respected when a policy is created. Nowadays, the whole world is paying attention to human rights. Thousands of black people are unfairly treated in USA. Japan is planning to let the polluted water into the ocean. All of these are criticized by people because the policy doesn't respect them and ruins their homeland. What we need to do is consider and respect local people when we put out a measure. The evidence in this argument is two real-world phenomena that are current and relevant to the theme of abuse of human rights by organizations and governments. The writer cleverly links these to the discussion about tribal peoples' rights. First and foremost, the rights of tribal people should not be violated. According to the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention published in 1981, tribal people's rights to live in their own lands should be protected and respected. In other words, tribal people cannot be driven out illegally from their homeland. Instead, they should go back to defend their lands and protect their territory. In conclusion, tribal people's right to their place should be protected and respected. This piece of evidence, in the first argument, avoids a problem that many of my students made. Remember that, to get a top grade, every claim you make must be supported by something external to your own opinions and feelings. In this essay, it was very common in the first argument for my students to make unsupported claims regarding the eviction of tribal people. Specifically, many of my students claimed that it was illegal for tribal people to be evicted, and their only support for this was that the tribal people have lived there for hundreds of years, so they cannot be removed. The problem is that this is only the writer's opinion that living somewhere for a long time automatically means that they must be allowed to live there forever. Therefore, someone else can easily argue that living somewhere does not automatically give someone the right to keep living there. There is no way to win a debate in this situation because both people can claim that they are correct. Therefore, we need the support of something external to our own feelings, such as the laws of an international organization, to win the debate. This writer did this very impressively by referring to a convention from 1981 which directly supports the writer's claim that they should not be forced to leave their land. First of all, tribal people have rights to live in their original lands. According to the Law of Environmental Protection of the United Nations, any construction of protected areas must protect the rights of the local people and cannot evict the original people from homelands without their agreement. Tribal people live in their homelands for years, and they have to depend on these lands. Therefore, we cannot deprive their rights because of conservation. This is very similar to the previous example. In this case, the writer refers to a law created by the United Nations to support his or her claim that tribal people cannot be forced to leave their land. Remember, you need something stronger than the assertion that living there for hundreds of years automatically gives them the right to stay, because perhaps the government in that country has no law that allows them to live there forever. First of all, it's illegal and inhuman to drive tribal peoples out from their ancestral homelands, which they have been dependent on and managed for thousands of years. Based on the Declaration of Independence in 1776, all men are created equal, which is regarded as the principle and ideal for people all around the world. Everybody has his or her own right to survive, despite his or her race. Besides, no one can deprive one's right to their lands according to international law. It's illegal to evict tribal peoples from their lands without permission. Therefore, it's essential to recognize and respect tribal peoples' right to their land. This is very similar to the previous two examples. In this case, the writer refers to a quote from the famous document, the Declaration of Independence, to support his or her claim that tribal people's rights must be respected and they should not be forced to leave their land. Tribal peoples staying in protected areas is significant for the ecosystem to maintain balance. A study conducted by the World Environment Protection Organization found that protected areas from which tribal people are driven out had suffered, on average, reduce of 40% in species, 15% higher than lands run by Bushmen. Let the statistics speak for itself. The eviction of tribal people will only lead to the damage of ecosystem. This argument uses an excellent statistic to strongly support Corey's first point. The numbers are specific percentages, and a specific organization published the study. The argumentative tone is also very strong, through phrases such as, "Let the statistic speak for itself." First and foremost, we should pay more emphasis on tribal people's right while preserving the environment. A study conducted by National Geographic magazine reveals that more than 75% of tribal people in the Amazon rainforest are expelled from their ancestral homes due to the conservation. Also, most of them have to abandon their original lifestyle, like hunting and fishing, and are having a great difficulty to satisfy their basic necessity. It is clear to me that such kind of preservation exploits Bushmen's birthright, not to mention the spiritual loss they have to endure. This argument uses an excellent statistic published by an expert organization to strongly support Corey's first point. Secondly, tribal people could be superior leaders in protecting their own lands due to their profound knowledge of their own culture. A study conducted by UNESCO in 2018 shows that countries where tribal peoples are leaders and conservationists are partners when it comes to defending the local lands can achieve better environmental protection compared to countries that evict the tribal peoples from their lands. Tribal peoples are more familiar with their landscape, their social and productive activities for which they have been dependent on and managed their lands for thousands of years, and they know how to live with the environment sustainably. Hence, as for environmental protection, tribal people should be treated as experts instead of conservationists. This statistic is excellent because it compares countries with tribal people as the experts and countries with the opposite situation, and demonstrates the benefits of treating tribal people as the experts. This is very strong evidence that is hard to refute. Tribal people themselves is an essential part of tribal culture. They have the rights to decide how to deal with their own land. A statistic conducted by Xi'an University implies that 18% of the tribal culture will be lost if the Aboriginals leave their homeland. From the perspective of preserving the tribal culture, it is vital to ensure the rights of tribal people so as to pass down the colourful tribal culture. This argument uses a relevant statistic published by a university to support Corey's first point. I am not exactly sure how the loss of culture can be measured in percentages, but it is nevertheless interesting and memorable. Firstly, we need to realize that tribal culture is a part of protected areas, while tribal people play a significant role in tribal culture. A well-known ecologist named Mike comments that a complete ecology system should involve human beings. His words sufficiently illustrate that the people who live here for thousands of years have integrated into the tribe environment and have an interaction to each other. It seems that you plant an apple tree in a place for many years. When one day you want to remove the tree, it may destroy the land where you put it. Therefore, tribal people would help us preserve the area, but not destroy it. This argument integrates two pieces of evidence, a quote from an expert and an analogy. Both of these work well together to support the argument. The only issue is that the expert is referred to with his given name, Mike, instead of his family name. If you refer to someone whom you don't know personally, then always use his or her family name. Firstly, tribal people's rights should be respected, for they are the true experts in conservation. There is a famous saying by Chinese writer Li Xianren, "You will never know it until you do it." The tribal peoples who has lived there for years got better command of the local ecosystem. An experiment carried out by the Zhejiang University has found that a knowledgeable doctor in environmental field performed less well in predicting the climate and animals' habits when compared with an old tribal member who lived there. The knowledge cannot apply to the changing situations in many cases. So, the tribal people's right should be respected. Like the previous example, the support for this argument is firstly a quote from a famous Chinese writer, and secondly the result from a study by a famous university. My only criticism is that the second piece of evidence might be more suitable for the second argument, which is why tribal people are better at conservation than the so-called experts. Apart from the protection of tribal culture, tribal people are known as the specialists of the protected areas as well. As a bushman from the central Kalahari Game Reserve in Botswana said, "Wherever there are bushmen, there is game." Why? Because we know how to take care of animals. His words remind me of my visit to an Aboriginal place in Australia. There, a tribal young man said something that has been haunted in my head. Our deep love for our own land is the secret why we are able to preserve this land better than any noble conservationist. Filled with passion and love for their home, tribal people are the top experts at protecting their own lands. Like the previous examples, the writer uses two pieces of evidence for the support in this argument. Firstly, a quote from the original article, and then an anecdote about a similar situation in Australia. As the original article was based on the situation in Africa, it is impressive that the writer referred to a similar situation from a different place. This demonstrates that the writer clearly understood the article. Secondly, tribal people know their own lands better than any others. Just as Bushman Dauchu Shukuri said, "Wherever there are bushmen, there is game." Why? Because we know how to take care of animals. They have lived in the protected areas for many years, and the protected areas didn't been broken. Therefore, tribal people have the ability to defend their own lands. I like this argument because the support of the topic sentence is taken from the article. The essay instructions encourage you to do this, and it can be useful if you cannot think of your own high-quality evidence. Of course, you should not only use information from the article to support your arguments, but you are welcome to do it occasionally if appropriate. Besides, tribal people should be treated as best experts at defending their own lands. These protected areas have been the home for these tribal people for thousands of years. There is no doubt that no one could be more familiar with these areas and know how to keep a balanced relationship with the local ecosystem than the tribal people. And we can conclude from the fact that millions are being spent by conservationists and the environment is in deepening crisis, that tribal people definitely are more qualified for defending their own lands. The support in this paragraph very closely references the article. This is a great skill because it demonstrates that the writer has understood the article. So, you do not need to directly quote from the article. You can instead paraphrase the information in order to support your argument. History has already told us whom the environment chooses. Bushmen have lived in their homeland for thousands of years without damaging the environment. Modern people have to admit that they truly have the wisdom to live in harmony with creatures in protected areas. Like the Chinese medicine, something discovered a special chemical in it which could cure special disease. It's clear that ancient people's intelligence is abundant and worth respecting and further studying. Therefore, these Bushmen should be treated as our teachers rather than be evicted. The language is fairly strong, and there is a lot of good information in this argument. However, there are issues with the argumentation. Firstly, I feel that the topic sentence isn't argumentative enough, as it doesn't clearly state the reason why the writer agrees with Corey's first point. Secondly, remember that the wrap-up sentence and the topic sentence must have similar meanings in order to make the entire argument cohesive. However, here, the wrap-up sentence doesn't echo the topic sentence. History has already told us whom the environment chooses. Therefore, these Bushmen should be treated as our teachers rather than be evicted. You can hear that there is no direct connection between them. Firstly, tribal people possess a profound knowledge tested by time and experience about protecting the land. An interestingly shocking investigation shows that almost 88% of tribal people know how to live there while minimizing the destruction to their homelands. Nearly 85% said they must obey the rule set by ancestors to hunt, build houses, and farm. Therefore, tribal people can apply their knowledge on protection of their homelands. The argument is good overall, as it contains a high-quality piece of evidence. However, it would be much better if there were a source for the statistic. In other words, I highly recommend that you state which organization created this statistic and what year the research was published. This would make the evidence more believable and thus more persuasive. The vulnerable character of protected areas determines that they need to be protected. Take an example. Some famous interests and place need restriction of the number of visiting people, the devices tourists bring, and the sounds they make. Because any overwhelming population, sounds, or radioactive devices will directly lead to the distinction of some arts in this area. In some area, tourists even need to wear gloves to protect their palm sweat from dissolving sculptures. These protected areas are so delicate that it desperately needs protection. This argument is irrelevant because there is no need to discuss that protection is necessary. This is because both the tribal people and the conservationists agree with that. Instead, the writer should explain why he or she thinks that the conservationists' form of protection is better than the tribal people's, or the other way around. For one thing, tribal people have better knowledge of wildlife. As we know, tribal people have managed to lead a life through many generations. They accumulated knowledge of wild animals and passed that on to ensure their sons and grandsons could also survive. Professional conservationists may have great physical knowledge about wildlife, but I believe tribal people master a far better life knowledge of that than creationists. Hence, we should let tribal people take part in protecting the lands. This argument contains both overstatement and conjecture through phrases like, "as we know," and "I believe." I have discussed both of these concepts in detail in previous episodes. To reiterate, without external support, the support is only based on the writer's opinion, and this is not convincing enough for an argumentative essay. You cannot only present your opinion and state that it is obvious, so that everyone already agrees with you. Instead, never assume the reader agrees with you. You need to work hard to convince the reader with high-quality evidence. Firstly, tribal people's rights have to be acknowledged. It's obvious that we should pay tribute to them, for they are the master of this area. Compared to them, we are nobody to this area. We can't force them to leave where they possess, either out of morality or justice. Instead, it is suitable for us to respect their rights. This paragraph again contains conjecture and overstatement, as it uses phrases like "it's obvious that," and it contains no external evidence. Therefore, this paragraph only contains unsupported opinions. Secondly, conservationists are not the manager of conservation, but the partners of tribal people. Since tribal people have lived on this land for many generations, their experience and knowledge is beneficial to how to balance the environment. By listening to them, conservationists might be stimulated to carry out more well-designed policies to make the ecology more flourish. It is also important that no excuses should be given by conservationists to reject the coordination with those local people, as they might understand what modern science might not predict perfectly, such as the most loved spot of lions. So, conservation could be promoted by cooperation with tribal people. Even though the language is excellent overall, there is a lot of conjecture throughout this paragraph, through words like might and could. Thus, the writer tells us what he or she assumes is true, without presenting any real evidence to support his or her claims. For example, how do we know that conservationists will improve their policies after listening to the tribal people? How do we know that conservation could be improved by cooperating with tribal people? Without external support, this is only the writer's opinions. Moreover, tribal peoples have been living in their ancestral homelands long enough to be the best experts at defending and conserving everything related to their culture. On the contrary, the so-called conservationists are actually the less professional person compared with the tribal peoples. It is possible that the conservationists might neglect the cultural meaning behind the lands, and what's worse, they are likely to destroy the precious historical relics with their modern technology. Therefore, in order to offer better protection for these lands, tribal people must be recognized as the experts, and people should take their advice. There is conjecture through phrases like, "it is possible that," and "they are likely to." These phrases reveal that the writer is simply presenting his or her opinion about what might happen. In an argumentative essay, we cannot use our opinion about what might happen to support an argument. To improve it, the writer could quote a scientist or conservation expert who previously witnessed these things happening. This would support the argument because someone else is substantiating the writer's claims. Firstly, the lifestyle of tribal people is the main cause of the destruction of the environment. Take the tribes in the Amazon as an example. To support themselves, they can only rely on agriculture without industry. After years of sowing and lack of fertilizer, the lands become more and more poor until they can't bear fruit. Then the tribes will destroy the forest and burn the wood as the fertilizer for their new land. Thus, more and more forests are ruined. This perfectly proves that the primitive lifestyle puts the environment in deepening crisis. I would accept the writer's example as a valid form of evidence in a high school essay or a freshman essay, but the TEM-4 essay requires every claim and every piece of evidence to be supported. It can easily be transformed into a valid form of evidence. For example, it could become an anecdote, such as, I watched a documentary last week called Tribes of the Amazon. I learned that, to support themselves, they can only rely on agriculture without industry, and so on. Or you could simply say, according to the documentary Tribes of the Amazon, to support themselves, these tribes only rely on. Or, according to an article published in the magazine National Geographic in 2019, to support themselves, Amazon tribes only rely on. These are all simple fixes, and they are very effective. First of all, the tribal peoples are well in how to protect their own homelands. It's obvious that the conservation has led to the eviction of millions of tribal people from protected areas. In other words, the protected areas need other experts to protect. However, I figure out that the most suitable one to make protection is the local people, for the reason that they know well with their own homeland than any others, and none of them will destroy homeland. Even though this paragraph quotes from the article in a few places, there is nevertheless a few issues. Firstly, the phrase, "it's obvious that," is overstatement, and the last sentence of the paragraph is conjecture. This is because the writer provides no evidence to support his or her claim that tribal people know their homeland better than other people, and that tribal people don't destroy their homeland. Therefore, the writer has given the reader no reason to agree that local people are the most suitable ones to protect their homeland. Firstly, it's important for tribal people to defend their homeland confidently. Everyone enjoy the same right all around the world. They're not supposed to be looked down upon. The place is belonged to them since a long time ago, which means tribal people are the owner of it. Legally and morally, no one can force the owner leave their place. When people do this, it can be defined as an act of robbery, which should be restrained by public and law. In summary, tribal people should act as the owner of their homeland and take the responsibility to protect it. This is an example of conjecture that many of my students used in their first argument. We can make the claim that it is morally wrong to force tribal people to leave the land they have lived on for hundreds of years, because morality is subjective. However, we cannot state that it is illegal to force them to leave without stating which law is being broken. If no law regarding this exists in the country that the tribal people live in, and if the tribal people have no legal document to prove that they own the land, then we cannot claim that they have been illegally removed from their ancestral homeland. I would like you to pause the video now and read this opinion section carefully yourself. The language of this opinion section is high level, so this student certainly has a very good English ability. However, The structure is poor, and the opinion section suffers from a lack of focus. As I said earlier in this episode, if you do not correctly identify Corey's 2 points, if you do not clearly state your opinion about the 2 points in your thesis statement, and justify your opinion in the body section, then your essay will be too general and lack focus. This opinion section is a perfect example of this. Firstly, the thesis statement is so vague that I cannot identify it. Also, the introduction itself is very long, and so it is as long as the 2 body paragraphs, which I do not recommend. Finally, there is no obvious conclusion paragraph. Overall, this opinion section got a very low grade, even though the student obviously has very good English. This demonstrates the importance of staying focused and directly answering the question. In conclusion, I totally agree with the 2 points made by Stephen Corey. We should pay our respect to the tribal people's rights and consider them as the best experts at defending their own lands. If we can do that, it is not only good for the tribal people, but also good for our protected areas. Because as the Bushman said, they know how to take care of animals. This conclusion has a very strong argumentative tone. The thesis echo restates Corey's 2 points, and the so what statement firstly presents a positive prediction, and then a quote from the article. To conclude, the vulnerable of areas and the unweariness of tribal people tell us to take actions to protect those areas from disappearing. At the same time, government should respect tribal people's right and give them compensation. In this way, not only can we protect our cultural area, but also can avoid tribal people's loss at largest degree. This so what statement is a focused and relevant recommendation. In conclusion, we have to admit the tribal people's rights and treat them as the best specialists at safeguarding their own lands. I highly recommend that the protection of tribal people's rights should be put into law. This so what statement provides a specific recommendation, which is that new laws should be created to prevent tribal people being forced off their land in the future. To sum up, it's time to realize that there is another way to conserve protected areas. I strongly recommend that conservation stick to international law, listen to local tribal people, and back them up as much as possible. The recommendation in this so what statement very closely paraphrases Corey's recommendations in the original article. This brings cohesion to the essay, as it reminds the reader that the essay was a specific, focused discussion about Corey's points. In brief, tribal people should be allowed to live in their homelands for the respect of protection of rights and lands. In addition, government ought to pay more attention to tribal people's suggestions and take them into account when designing a protection plan. I believe if the government can adhere to this rule, the protected area will be better and better. This so what statement is a positive prediction about the benefits of following the writer's recommendations. The recommendation, in this case, is the writer's opinion about Corey's 2 points. Only after we respect the tribal people and see them as experts can we be able to reach the core of conservation, to preserve the precious natural and cultural scenery of the world. The active involvement of the tribal people will certainly contribute to a maturer and comprehensive conservation model. This so what statement is another positive prediction. To finish up, it is time to wake up and realize that tribal people and conservation is not an either-or question. Why can't we do as the Survival's director said, to sketch for a brighter future for both human and environment? This so what statement is a question. By finishing your essay with a question, the reader will naturally think about the answer after he or she finishes reading, and thus the consequences of your conclusion will be more memorable and persuasive for him or her. Near the conclusion, the disadvantages of driving tribal people out are obvious. What we need to do first is to respect the tribal people and then treat them as the best experts at protecting their own lands. Just as Chinese old saying says, many hands make light work. Cooperating is the best way to protect these areas. This so what statement contains a relevant and interesting Chinese idiom. As I've previously said, the examiner will be very impressed if you can find connections between situations in other countries and situations in your own country. Therefore, I highly recommend using Chinese examples and Chinese quotes in your essay if they are relevant to the topic. This is the end of the video about the TEM-4 2018 essay. If you liked what you heard, then you can find more videos in my Writing Skills series, as well as other series on the topics of English and linguistics. Thank you for watching.